Hi there, and welcome to Hearthside. My name is Michelle. I'm the author on this blog. I'm just making everything a little bit more accessible by making video copies of my blog entries. And the one that I'm looking at right now is about land taking and Hallowing, the historical traditions, and then looking at how we can modernize them so that they make more sense for us. So, first of all, I want to suggest a few books if you haven't seen these ones before. Claude Lecouteux is an awesome author with different subjects that are heathen related. This one was the first one on this particular topic that I read, the tradition of household spirits. And I find this one a little bit dry, but there's like a ton of good information in there. A less dry read that's also related and has a lot to do with the actual land taking ceremonies if you're moving into a new place, and also to do with Landvatir, is this one called Demons and Spirits of the Land. So those two books I really suggest. The other source that I used that was my main other source for this is actually an archived essay by Hnefill, and it's called Land Taking and Leave Taking Rituals for Moving House, and I will link that down below, even though it's archived because it was on a very old website that doesn't exist anymore. It's still accessible and it's still relevant, and I would highly recommend it. So if we're looking at different sources, a lot of our sources that we're looking at are the Icelandic Book of Settlements, for example, because for the most part, historic heathens didn't do a lot of moving because the homes would be passed down within the family for multiple generations. But with moving to Iceland, we start to see what it looks like if someone has to move their home. So the first thing that I want to say is that it's a little bit different now than it would be then, because our idea of land ownership is actually a fairly new idea, and it would have been more like land dwelling or land stewardship in historical times, where like you would have your house, but there would be a lot of shared common area, and then the land that you were using and the land that you were taking in your land taking ritual would have been the land that you're using to farm and support your family or your tribe. In a modern sense, you don't even always necessarily have land with your house, and the other difference is that your house is usually built before you moved in. There might have been previous occupants that were not family members, that were not heathen. So it's a really different approach from historically when you're looking in the modern day. But what I want to do is sort of look at what things happened historically in a land taking ceremony and then seeing how we can apply them in the modern day. So there's a few elements that seem to be very common in a land taking, right? Usually walking around the boundary of the property, quite often in a sunwise direction, but not always. And this process is also known as circumambulation. The other thing that seems to be common in it is declaring to the whites your intentions to take stewardship of the land. Beyond that, it does vary from source to source. There does seem to be a lot to do with fire being used in some way, which I'll get into in a minute. But those two main things, going around the border of the property as well as declaring your intent, seem to be pretty much standard for all of the sources that I've found. Some examples of different ways that you can go around your property, like you can walk in a procession. There is also historical evidence of women walking around leading a cow, or people riding around on a mare. And sometimes walking around making loud noises and at each of the corners of the property, as well as brandishing torches as you go. Another one that is from the Claude Lecouteux, which he takes a lot of stuff from folklore sources as well as from like the lore and like the Book of Settlements and stuff. And something that he suggests is that you go around to each corner of the property and you take soil from those locations and then you bury it under your doorstep. If we look further, we see that there's more ways other than torches that fire is used. In the Book of Settlements, other than carrying fire around the perimeter, fire was also used, and they would set fires on the perimeter. They would start in the east in the morning, and then in the west at sunset, so that they were traveling across their land over the course of a day in order to do the land taking, because usually they wouldn't take more land than you could travel across in one day. It was believed that the fire element was to drive away the wild wights, who were chthonic in nature, and there's other ways that they were used to scare them off as well, such as using a hammer or an axe, which was usually thrown. There's one instance where you wait until noon and then you throw the axe to the east and then to the west. It's noted in the source that you would not throw it towards the north because the Icelandic people of that time did not believe in putting a hedge to the north, so you would not throw it in that direction. The other thing that's quite often done is the marking of the boundaries of the property using poles or staffs that are stripped of their bark. And I see a parallel in the modern times in the way that surveyors mark the corners of property, although I think they do it for a different reason. But I wonder if that might have a common root. So, also shooting flaming arrows to mark boundaries, especially if your boundary of your property, for example, like is going to be on the other side of a river or something. Instead of finding a way to cross it, you might shoot a flaming arrow across in order to claim that parcel of land. And other than just throwing the hammers and the axes, they were also used to mark boundaries, and sometimes an image was carved into a tree or a piece of wood of a hammer and axe in order to mark a boundary. So these are like the things that are the most common within it. And then there's the matter of, after you've taken the land, hallowing the land, which is seen as a different thing, which is to say that you would create sacred space. Now, that might be a space such as a vey or like a temple space or something, or it could be seen just as the enclosure of your farmstead. The thing with the ancient heathens was a lot of them did not build a vey on their land, but rather they would look to the natural features of the land and they would consider them to already be sacred and then use them for their ritual, whether it's a waterfall or whatever that might be. So if you're looking at your land, if you've got a big parcel of land, you might consider what natural features lend themselves to being that sort of vey space already, a grove of trees, a waterfall, some sort of other water feature, a big stone that happens to be on your property already. And they also were looking for signs from birds and animals that might lead them to a space that they would use as sacred space. You can also see that when the Icelandic people moved their homes, they brought with them items that they held sacred from their previous home. Quite often these were the pillars of their high seat, and they saw the home as being protected by certain deities. Quite often Freyr or Thor were among them, and often the high seat would be carved with images of these deities. So another element, now we're not going to necessarily have a high seat in our home necessarily, but it's good to think about what associations with what deities when you're looking at creating your own ritual. So the way I see it is when you're doing the circumambulation, doing the land taking first, it's sort of like a heathen ritual or bloat, in that you would like cleanse and ward the space first before you welcome in the gods and create that hallowed space inside. Where this breaks down is more that in the modern times, it doesn't make sense in the same way to take all the land at once and then build in, because your house is probably already built. So then, quite often, you're doing the opposite. You're starting inside your inner yard first, slowly taking more land at different levels of enclosure so that it's like comfortable what you're taking. Also, because you're not necessarily growing your own food, or not all of it, you have less need of creating that same space initially. If you look at a modern home, then you can see that there's several levels of enclosure. Of course, there's your house, and then maybe if you have like a porch or a balcony, that would be another separate layer, then like your garden, and then you get to the hedge. Now, depending on how big your property is, you're also possibly going to have like a field or something, and then beyond that, wild lands. So how much you want to take initially is up to you, and in some cases you might have an apartment and you won't have any other outside space, and you won't even be trying to take claim of the whole building. It wouldn't even make sense for you to circumambulate the building, because there's other people who live there and most of them aren't heathen, and that's not all your space. So really, if you're doing some sort of land taking or ownership thing for your apartment, you're only going to circumambulate around the outside of your apartment unit, like just going to all the walls with whatever incense or candle or whatever and creating that space. So just, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's sort of reversed from the way that it would have been historically, just because of the way that we live now. And there's not as much necessity, if you're not growing all your own food, to take charge of that land as quickly. Because what happens is, when you say that you'll take stewardship of that land from the whites, then there's this expectation that now you are going to care for that land. And if you're not prepared to do that, then the whites are going to start encroaching again. And even if you are caring for it, they're still going to occasionally try to encroach on it, just to test your boundaries a little bit. So that's why, like, I've just moved recently, and I haven't even taken stewardship of my back garden yet, because I am trying to work on everything in the interior of the house this year first, before I want to take stewardship of that. Sorry, I'm getting distracted because someone is blowing a bullhorn outside. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. And, yeah, so creating a vein wouldn't necessarily happen historically, but a lot of modern heathens might create a Vey on their property at some point once you're ready to expand. And the way I see it is, even if you're taking sort of ownership of your house first and then your land, the Vey would be a step after your land, and then you're coming back to that enclosure space again, and it's almost an enclosure within an enclosure. So even in modern times, that still stands, where you would do the land taking before you hallow a space like a Vey. So in that sense, it does still fit with the historical pattern. That's pretty much it for this one. I hope you enjoyed. Hope it got you thinking a little bit about your space, or if you're moving and it helps you out. Check out the links that I will include of the sources that I used, and I will see you next time.